talking to other dads now, they all feel that initial, like, when are you and I going to be a thing?
Yeah. Yep.
It's like,
That's a good way to put it.
When are we going to hang out and be cool with each other?
Hello and welcome to the Dad Dialogue podcast, the show where we talk about the successes and the stresses of becoming a dad and being a dad. My name is Laurence and I am your host. Before I introduce today's guest, quick reminder, you can go over to daddialogue.co.uk if you'd like to get in touch with the show or sign up to be a guest on a future episode. Joining me today is Shaun. Shaun is based in America. He is the father to one daughter, and the primary focus of our conversation was about the process of Shaun's daughter needing to be fitted with a gastro tube, a tube that would feed her directly into her stomach, because she was born fairly prematurely, and then some different things happening during her early stages of development as a newborn. We dive into a lot of detail into the story, and I really encourage you to stay by and listen. This particular situation and circumstance that Shaun has found himself in for his family may not be relatable for many people, but I find that in the conversation we really get to the heart of what it is to be a father, to try to be prepared and to try and do your best for your family in every situation, no matter what the circumstance is. And I think you can really see Shaun's heart in this conversation. I was so appreciative for him for coming on the show and being open and vulnerable in the situation, and sharing about these steps that have led to this and kind of the positive that they can kind of take out of the situation as well, and still look at the heart of being a father and the heart, like the love that he finds in his daughter as well and his growing family. So I really did appreciate Shaun coming on the show. Let's get into the conversation. All right, so Shaun, thank you so much for taking the time joining us here today on the Dad Dialogue podcast. Can you just start off by just telling our listeners just a little bit about yourself and your family?
Yeah, my name is Shaun Fitzgerald. I live in the Florida area. Currently, my family is just the four of us. So it's myself, my wife, my newborn daughter. Well, I say newborn, 14-month-old daughter. And we have a 2-year-old Doberman Pinscher that has a beautiful little brown coat. So he's a good boy.
That's awesome. So it's funny that you say newborn and then remind yourself it's like 14 months. That time can often feel like it absolutely flies by, and obviously what we're going to talk about today, is that how it has felt? Does it feel like the time has flown, or does it?
Yeah, we'll get into this in a moment, but my daughter spent a long time in the NICU. Probably not the longest for some of your listeners, but 60, I want to say 2 off the top of my head. I gave you the exact amount of time, but more than 60 days in the NICU. So we felt like we lost that entire 2 months with her. My wife was there every single day with her. I had to go back to work because somebody needed to have income. So I was seeing her after work every chance I had. But there's times when I look back, I'm like, we lost that entire time period with our daughter.
Yeah, that's really rough. And we're going to dive into this and kind of unpack why the 68 days were there. But just on what you mentioned, I'm curious if other people do know of longer stories, because I've spoken to lots of dads that have had like a few days to a week, like lots of various situations about going to the NICU. But yeah, 68 days, that's by far and away the longest I've heard. So I'm sure I hadn't even begun to think about what you just shared, that's 2 months of the early development stages that you are just gone. And I hadn't even thought about that and what that kind of looks like. So let's get straight into it if you're happy to. Can you share with us why she had to go into the NICU when she was born?
Yeah, a little bit of that comes down to my wife's health. So she was retaining a lot of liquid.
Okay.
And it got to the point where she was showing full term, and we were 30 plus weeks in. Right. So she was getting pretty large, and her hands were starting to puff up from just all the liquid retention that her body was carrying. Wow. It got to the point where she woke up one morning and said, I'm pretty sure my water broke. It's happening. So we started rushing out, doing what we needed to do to get her to the hospital. We get there. There's some confusion between the staff, her gynecologist, and then the on-site gynecologist. So there's 2 gynecologists going back and forth. One doesn't think that the water had broken yet, and then her main gynecologist agreed, yeah, it broke. This is going on. But we're super early at this point. It's 33 weeks. So the intention there at that time period was they were going to keep her in the hospital until the baby just started naturally coming, with the intention of the longer the baby was inside of her, the better it would be. So we start preparing to be there a week plus. I think it was about 4 hours of being in the hospital. My wife suddenly said, I'm having a pain in my my upper back just below my lower ribs. Her gynecologist comes in and says, okay, well, that's too much of where your kidney is, and we can't see anything, so we're going to do an emergency C-section.
Wow.
And obviously not what my wife's birth plan was. We didn't want to go this route, but, it was that or further health complications. So I need to take a step back. I'm sorry. There's so much information that happened at that time period. There was a point where they tried to induce labor, and that medication, I think that medication might have caused that pain. I don't have any medical knowledge to know if that's a possibility. So wife gets rushed back. I get into their temporary clean suit, and then we go into the NICU. And honestly, the birth was way faster than I anticipated it being, because I didn't know anything about how quick a C-section could be. But I put on that outfit. I walked in, and they were already making the first incision. And I went back there to comfort my wife. She was so out on the medication that they had given her that she wasn't very lucid. She was just kind of drifting in and out. And then suddenly I had my daughter in my hands. They were cleaning her down, and we were out. And that was probably an hour before my wife was able to come back, coming off the medication. And then this is where it starts getting painful. And, my wife, she's listening to this. She's probably just going to want to turn it off right here. We didn't get to see our daughter after that for almost 8 hours, just hanging into the hospital.
Wow.
I got to go see her that night, and she was put into the small incubators, protect against jaundice. And the next day, my wife was going through a lot of emotions because she hadn't seen her baby yet. And they said, well, we need you to be able to walk. And she said, why can't you put me in a wheelchair? And then the hospital came back and said, well, you need to stay on oxygen. We don't have a way to give you oxygen while you're going down the hallway. And we just had to keep pushing on the hospital. And finally, they were able to get us a mobile oxygen unit. So my wife didn't get to hold our daughter for the first 12 hours, 12 or 15 hours of her being on the planet with us. So that's when things start getting complicated. When you're that early, they check for a lot of problems. I can't remember exactly what it was, but she needed to be intubated that second day. So a tube was put into her mouth, make sure that she was getting everything she needed. And that was only about a day or so. And they unintubated her, and things were fine. She was struggling to eat a lot of food at that time period. And they said, well, hey, this is common for newborns when they're coming out of the NICU in this situation. Then we had more complications. They said, hey, we need to intubate her again. So we went back and they intubated her again. And we would later find out that this is probably what caused the biggest issues for her. So when you're intubated at that early of an age, the roof of your mouth hasn't already come all the way down. And that's a problem for a newborn, because without that roof of your mouth coming down, at about that time period that she was at is when the baby develops that ability to understand how to use its tongue and its throat to swallow. So without that roof there, she doesn't have anything to push her tongue against and swallow. But we didn't know this at the time period. So everything comes back, they unintubate her, and she's now fed through a tube that goes through her nose. So she has food pumped in through her nose for any food that she can't take by her bottle. So she takes about half a bottle every day, And then we get to a point where we think everything's getting better because she's able to take a whole bottle. And then right after that next bottle, the next feeding, she won't take any food at all. And it's like this for days on end with her. So we start looking at other options. If she's tongue tied, which is a small piece of flesh that like holds the tongue down underneath the mouth. They come back and they say, hey, we're not going to be able to tell that until she's a little bit older. You might have to wait until she's discharged to confirm whether or not she's tongue tied. We're brand new parents, so we don't know how much of this is accurate. We're taking our medical professionals for their word at it. So we try to keep her in there until she starts taking all of her food. And the amount that she's taking starts to go down week by week. And it gets to the week of when the Americans celebrate Thanksgiving, which is the end of November. And that's when we are told, so she has an option. She can stay in there indefinitely until she swallows and she takes all of her food. But the hospital doesn't want to do that. What they want to do is they want to do a surgery that cuts open a part of her stomach, about a dime-sized hole. They push a tube in there, and then on top of the tube, they put a bubble over it, a balloon, fill it with water, and it becomes like a little button. So if you have like a blow-up beach toy, the buttons that come out of it, you pull out and blow up. It looks exactly like that. And that button, though, at the top, the nipple enables a tube to be connected, and then we're able to take a machine home, and we can do the same type of machine feeding to keep feeding her. And I was absolutely against any type of surgery at all. I wanted to wait as long as possible. So Thanksgiving comes and goes, and we're now approaching almost the second week of December, and we decide if we keep her in the hospital too long, she starts losing other opportunities for critical development. For example, it's really important for babies at that stage to start to like attempt to roll when they're comfortable. If she's in the NICU, she won't be given that opportunity. She will have to stay in their crib the entire time. So we didn't want to hinder her in other ways. So we agreed to go through the surgery. Surgery goes through smoothly, and then we don't get her back until 2 days before Christmas, which, being a baby born in mid-October and then not getting to actually have her home until December, that by itself was a tribulation for us. But that, what we didn't realize is everything we were going to have to learn having a baby with a G-tube installed in her stomach at this point. Do you want me to go into that portion of it, or is there anything you want to stop? And
I mean, there's so much to kind of dive into for sure. Thank you so much for kind of going to it. I can tell this is not like an easy thing to talk about. I just want to kind of bounce back in a way that I recently mentioned in a solo episode, like a thing I called Dad Diary, that like I never really had much fear in my life until I got married and had kids. And this thing, I think this is fairly prevalent amongst men, at least men that are maybe like within a middle class background, have some sort of privilege, who maybe haven't had to worry about food being on a plate at the end of every day. And I think it then becomes quite common when men are preparing to become fathers, that all these things can't start going through their brains about what happens if this happens, what about this, what about this. So I just think that hearing stories like this and kind of like being able to put a face to the story and like see the heart behind it, I think it's just such a powerful thing. And I hope that there are some people listening that can kind of like understand what this might look like, because it's almost the fear of the unknown that can sometimes get the better of us. So I kind of want to take us back, if we can, just to kind of some of those moments. Like, are there any moments that really stand out to you where you were just kind of like at a loss, like where you were just, well, what's going to happen? You mentioned that you had to take the medical professional's words as gospel, so to speak. Like, you had to trust them because you like, how else? You don't know. No one does research into this sort of thing. Did you know that this was a possibility with your, like with your wife having her like kind of prenatal checkups and things? Like, did they know that there was a possibility of the water breaking at 33 weeks?
No, it was a shock when it happened for us. So the term or the medical diagnosis that it is it's called preeclampsia. And for anybody out there, there's nothing that women do to cause it. So it's not a genetic thing necessarily. It's not a lifestyle thing. Some women are just predisposed to it. Maybe there's something genetically. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but it's not something that she brought on herself, basically. I just need to make sure anybody out there that's hearing or watching this, if they hear this, it's not like something you can easily avoid.
Yeah.
So we knew about that, I want to say at week 25, but at the time period, they said, if you're not experiencing pain, you're not experiencing discomfort, and the baby is still healthy inside, there's no reason to think that it's going to be risky for anybody. And the baby, our child, she didn't have any signs inside there that there was problems. So the gynecologist said, hey, we just keep monitoring it. But when she woke up and, said, hey, my water broke, it was just time to go. It was early, and I knew some complications could come from, being premature. 33 weeks is early, but it's not the earliest I've heard of babies being born.
Yeah.
So I thought, small size, maybe a little bit behind her peers in certain things. But I never could have imagined a G-tube. I didn't even know a G-tube for children was a thing until this happened. I didn't know about the roof of the mouth coming down the way it did. There's a whole bunch of things I can tell you, like everything that happened after birth that we've had to go through, that it wasn't something that we ever thought of. Everything else with our daughter is perfectly fine. Like, she's exactly like a 14-month-old. She loves to play. She babbles. She's learning how to walk. So we have everything else going on, but she just has this one abnormality that, is artificial with her. Other areas where things really got tense for us was, I think once we realized that my wife, Brittany, wasn't going to get to see our daughter the first day, that was really hard. And she was on a magnesium drip to help her body recover post-procedure. And magnesium isn't like when you and I take magnesium as a supplement. The drip is very intense, and it changes the way she smells and tastes everything.
Wow.
And as much as we want to say that we're better than animals, and just because we're humans and we have the capacity to think, we still are animals. And it comes down to when she got to see our daughter, the magnesium was causing her to just smell the magnesium, and she could only taste the magnesium. And she struggled very hard. If there was ever an instant type of postpartum depression, she experienced it right then and there, because when she finally did get to see our daughter, the biological smells that you would get from your child, she wasn't picking up on. And that really killed her, and she had a hard time adjusting to that. So as the dad, we want to take care of our women. We want the best for our kids, but there's nothing we can do to fix that situation. Ultimately, she just had to get off the magnesium, and it takes about 72 hours for that magnesium to get completely out of her body, where she's not tasting and smelling it all the time. So it took almost a week for her to finally get that bonding experience with our daughter. And I say bonding experience because just holding her isn't the same as like when you and I hold our children. There's a chemical reaction that happens for her when she smells the thing that she produced. It's very important for women to have that opportunity. The next and final argument that came up between us was the surgery. I'm not a violent person when it comes to disagreements, but that's probably the biggest disagreement my wife and I had was over the surgery, because I just didn't want her to be as little as she is, to go under anesthesia and have a hole drilled into her stomach. It wasn't an option to give her any bigger disadvantage than she's already at with not being able to swallow.
I mean, coming to terms and like kind of trying to make those decisions is such a difficult thing, I'm sure, because you can weigh up pros and cons, but at the end of the day, you just like your heart and your head they just feel things, and I think that's a totally reasonable thing to want. It's like, let's do everything within our power to not to go down this road of her having surgery. So yeah, I totally resonate with you that of wanting, yes, you want what's best for your child, but then if someone tells you, it's like, oh well, the numbers say that what's best for your child is to do this, this, and this. And it's like, well, numbers are like statistics or whatever. Like it's so difficult to see past that when it's like the child that you've created. I just want to circle back a little bit. So with the preeclampsia, my wife also had preeclampsia with our first son. She was noted as being like high risk of preeclampsia. So all her checkups to blood pressure and things. And then I think, I can't remember exactly why, but there was like more of a gap between her checkups than maybe there should have been, only by like a few days, but maybe like 5 or 6 days. So I think she was 35 weeks and 6 days or something, 5 days or something like that. She went for a prenatal checkup, and this was the first one she'd had for a couple of weeks. And then they took her blood pressure, and they were like, sit down, we've called an ambulance, you're going to hospital. Because she was having a checkup at a separate clinic. And she was then kept in hospital for until 37 weeks when they induced. And they said that she had preeclampsia, and because of the blood pressure being so high. So yeah, and again, it's one of these things that you just never know about when you're maybe as a man, when your wife first gets pregnant. It might come up in some class. But yeah, like you said, there's not really anything you can do about it apart from know if your wife is predisposed to it or not, and then like just hope for the best and make sure the checkups go smoothly. So yeah, again, just one of those information things that it's just useful to have that information, and I think still useful to have some of those stories. And then I did want to jump and dive into, if you're okay with it, to what you mentioned about a possible instant form of postpartum depression, and just kind of in a frame for you as well and your wife. Did the hospital and the doctors, how proactive were they in terms of like your mental health going through this process?
They weren't proactive at all. We have a lot of issues with the way we were treated and the hospital overall. And to a point, I would say that the second intubation, I'm going to come back to your question but I want to kind of highlight the way the hospital was. The second intubation, the more we looked into it after our daughter's birth, was probably unnecessary. And that second intubation is what we think caused the roof of her mouth to stay up there. So that's a conversation for another time, a whole nother realm that we have to get into with the hospital, what was and wasn't right. So her gynecologist doesn't pick up on the cues of depression necessarily. Great doctor, but not on that side. So I remember I had to explain to one of the nurses that came in to check on her. I was like, hey, she's not feeling too good. She's experiencing a lot of sadness, and we want to see our daughter more often. But they wanted my wife to stay in the bed as much as possible those first couple days after the surgery. So they finally brought in a counselor. I don't want to say a psychologist. I think it was just a counselor that they brought in. And they had a conversation, and it seemed to go all right. I stayed in it during the entire time. My wife wanted me to be there. So, anybody listening, it's not like I was hovering around her. I did what she wanted me to do. And then they brought in somebody who had a service animal, a dog, right, come in and hang out with my wife. My wife, for whatever reason, and I tease her about this today, now that, the seriousness is over, my wife cried over our dog not being able to come see her the first 48 hours. So I tease my wife about that now. But yeah, they brought a service animal in to come see her. And then every other day, a service animal came by and said hi to her. And I think that kind of helped her. But had it not been for me to say something to our nurses several times, we wouldn't have got that treatment. And then I think the most beneficial person that probably came and talked to my wife is they had a couple. Oh man, I can't remember what they call these nurses now. Specifically helping her to breastfeed because we were trying to do breastfeeding early on.
Yeah, lactation specialist.
There we go. Thank you so much. It's all the terms are falling out of my head. So they brought in the lactation specialist, and we had the first one, and she was great. She knew how to do all the second things. But then the second lady came in, and she was much older, and she knew all the medical side of it. But she also understood a little bit more about what my wife was going through. Mm-hmm. She stayed there and talked with my wife just about what it's like being a mom while she was going through all the things with her, and telling her how often she needs to do things to make sure her own health is being taken care of. And she was probably the single most useful person that came in outside of me being there with my wife.
Wow. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, because it was a question, or something that I was thinking about, at least in terms of breastfeeding and obviously the stigma around breastfeeding almost. I've spoken to a couple of other dads in the past that have shared on their wife's behalf of going through struggles with breastfeeding, of, the people who say like breast is best and the breastfeeding's everything, but then like not remembering that some people try it and they struggle with it. And, if you're willing to share, I obviously with this thing that's gone on with your daughter, or of the problem with her mouth, how did it go? Was it something that was able to take?
So she didn't want to latch because she was just so premature. Eventually she started to latch. My wife produced, but she wasn't a heavy producer. So we still had to supplement some of it with formula, even from the beginning. And, we're going to get into the part where she was discharged. My wife pumped for 8 or 9 months consistently, and we would still have to supplement all of her feedings with some formula at some point throughout the day. So she was never fully able to feed her just based off what she was produced. So we have a little bit of both in that realm, so I can kind of see how people, because my wife did get self-conscious about not being able to produce enough, and completely understandable. That's what women go through when they're in that situation. But it was harder that our daughter just wasn't eating at that point, and we had to pump it in, which gets into, the trials and tribulations we went into with getting the pump after the discharge. But I can save that story for once we're ready to get to that side of the story.
Yeah, we can dive in a little bit. I'm curious to kind of know what the ins and outs of it look like. Did you know you could have got access to this interview and all the other Dad Dialogue interviews a whole week early by signing up on the Dad Dialogue Patreon page? There's also access to the exclusive Dad Diary Deep Dive. And if you are watching this interview or listening to this interview the month that it was published in March, the new Dad Diary Deep Dive will be coming very, very soon. So do go over to Patreon and sign up for that if you want to get access to that exclusive content, as well as early access to the interviews. Links in the description. Let's get back to the conversation. I did just want to take the moment to say for anyone listening, I have seen it popped up in some forums and things, and I will hold my hands up wholeheartedly. And I now have 2 sons, two kids. That with my first one, I just did not know. I was selfish and idiotic when it came to trying to support my wife in the breastfeeding process. And especially when it comes to pumping. Like, pumping is hard. Like, it's annoying. It's an inconvenience. Like, genuinely, I used to kind of get confused by my wife. It's like, why do you need this extra 30 minutes to go ahead and do it, and be kind of, you can't do anything else at the same time, or why is it so difficult? I was trying to encourage her, you're going back to school. She only got 13 weeks off, or 11 weeks off of work because of how things work in Hong Kong, and where my kids were born. Other story. She was like, "Oh, I'm going to need to try and pump at school where she was working, and then find somewhere to put it." And then she would often tell me that, the room that I used for pumping was busy, so I couldn't do it, or I couldn't put it in the fridge, and she had all these troubles with it. And I would kind of get, well, why is this so difficult? I was kind of really coming from a place of pointing the finger at her, and I've seen in other forum posts of dads maybe looking for advice from other dads who are possibly pointing the finger at their partner in terms of oh, she wants to get better at pumping, but that she went out with her friends and missed a session or whatever. And I'm saying, well, why are you going out with your friends and missing a session? It's like, it's really hard for anyone that's listening. And we as men are never going to know what it entails. Like, we're never going to know what it's like to bring a baby to term. We're never going to know what it's like going through birth or a C-section. We're never going to know what it's like to have preeclampsia. And we're definitely never going to know what it's like to pump milk. So for anyone that is listening, if that thought has ever crept in, you really, really need to like make sure your wife is like being loved and adored for trying to produce milk for your child. And I'm kind of talking to myself from a few years ago as well as anyone that's listening. So I just want to take a moment to do that, to kind of like jump on that grenade for all of us. It's not worth it. You have to try. So yeah, can we get into maybe what it was like after you discharged? Like, did the doctors kind of prepare you for what life was like once you guys got home? What has it been like to kind of settle in terms of your routine of what you guys have to do to support your daughter with food? Like, what did it look like once you did get home?
Yeah, so I'm going to back up just a little bit to share another part of the experience on this one. So the final 2 weeks of being in the NICU, we tried to do a full night stay where it was like the discharge stay here, what they do here at least. I don't know about the rest of the world, where you spend like a full 24 hours in a small room as if you were back home with your child. So we tried it once before the surgery to just see if she would get hungry enough that she would naturally take onto the bottle, and she just wasn't doing it at that point. So we went through the surgery, and we did it again once the surgery was done, with the training of how to do everything we were going to have to do at home with the machine. So this comes down to, you have to measure out the breast milk and the formula in a certain way. You have to set up the machine. You have to set up the milliliters that you're going to pump into the child, and then the amount of time it takes to pump in. So there's two different metrics that you have to balance there. And then you have to keep the formula / milk at a certain temperature and make it at certain times so that it doesn't go bad. Pour it into these bags. And these bags that they give you that the machines pump into are good for 24 hours. And then there's a connector at the end that has to be washed after every day's use. So we go through that. We do it successfully for a day. We get discharged. And then I feel like the next hardest hurdle came through with us, because there's a combination of us having to deal with the pump, the medical supplies that we have to have supplied to us. And then on the flip side, she's now doing physical therapy and she's doing speech therapy. And if anybody's listening to this while she's doing speech therapy, it's because at the time period, they thought that her swallowing problem was tongue tie. So we were waiting for that to come through. And we were doing physical therapy sessions with her mouth to ensure that it wasn't either her cheeks were, like, not her cheeks, her jaw muscles weren't locked up, causing her not to swallow, and making sure that it wasn't tongue tie. I'll say right now, we can go up and down on the American healthcare system. We would not have been able to do this if we didn't have my wife's insurance. So I have insurance through one of my work partners, but it's not great. My wife has insurance because she's a state employee, right. And that's the only reason that we're able to do what we do with our daughter, because what we have to do with this pump is we have to order these bags, and you can't just order them easily and cheaply by yourself. And then the machine has to be given to you, and the machine's ungodly expensive as well. And it's just a small little block device that has a mechanism that turns and it pumps water or fluid through a tube when you have it connected. But that brings us to a big problem with how we have to support our daughter. We are constantly on a timeline of when we can and can't order these bags. So when you get these bags, you get a shipment, you have 20 days until you're allowed to call them again. And you have to call them and place the order again, which sounds like it's not that big of an issue, but the problem is they only give you a 30-day supply. And not every month has 30 days. So you order it and you come to a month that has 31 days. You might not get that shipment of bags again until 3 or 4 days after the next month starts already. So you're constantly trying to weigh it, find suppliers elsewhere that you can buy from, so you always have a surplus of these bags. And then on top of that, I live in Florida, so we have a lot of God's natural fun that comes to our way. Hurricanes, tornadoes, things of that nature that will stop supplies from coming. So we were hit by a tornado 5 months after my daughter was born, and my entire neighborhood was hit very hard. Trees were down everywhere, and that became a point of concern. So my friend Billy Cowart and myself went out there, and we cut our way out of my neighborhood. He went from one end, he had a front loader, and I just took my chainsaw, and we worked front to back, cutting a way out so that if we needed to get out or an ambulance needed to get to my daughter, we were able to do it. Wow. And then for the next 2 weeks, we cut our way out of my, he went home. I just spent the next 2 weeks with my chainsaw and his front loader and cut all my neighbors out because the state couldn't get to us. The city couldn't get to us. We were isolated, and we had to do what we had to do at our level.
Wow.
So that was all additional stresses that we needed to put in there. So then on the physical therapy side, I want to say it was like 3 months in, and speech therapy finally came back and said, hey, she doesn't have tongue tie. Her tongue's moving freely, and there's no problems with her jaw muscles. She's doing everything she needs to do. It's like there's not a problem there. And then that's when they finally told us, like, it's because the roof of her mouth didn't come down. And for those listening, why that's such an important area is back to when she was born premature. That's when that developmental key area happens, where she learns that her tongue can go up, and that helps her swallow. Because she never learned that, she can swallow, but she immediately gags now, which develops with the G-tube inside of her and that problem of gagging. It creates GERD, which is a constant gastral reflux problem for anybody. It's not specific for children. So she now has GERD because of the combination of these problems. So a part of her therapy that we have to do here at home ourselves is we have to give her water, which she can drink water now finally. I'd say for the last 3 months, she's been able to drink water without spitting it up. A huge milestone for us, which is ridiculous given, that she's 14 months old. But she has a hard time with anything that has any consistency to it. So we'll give her food and she'll chew on it. But if she gets any of it off and into her mouth, she immediately just gags. It's not like she's doing anything wrong. She just doesn't know what to do with it getting back there. Even those little kid treats that are like kind of baby cereal that like becomes mush when it gets wet with saliva, it causes her to gag. And if she gags too much, she throws up, which then is a concern for growth, because if you're constantly throwing up, you're not getting enough calories in to encourage that growth that we need to see. All this to say, we constantly had to go through fighting insurance to find a therapist that they would support or programs that we qualified for. I'm obviously at a certain level, you can see just by where I'm sitting. We don't qualify for a lot of social programs that would assist people with these situations. So it was either we pay out of pocket, which despite what it looks like behind me, we don't have the money to pay the out of pocket side of it, or we fight to find these ands or buts that we can get with to ensure that she's getting the support that she needs that's professional. That's not just my wife and I. And then daycare is also a problem, because with the way that she needs to be fed, I'd say like 90% of daycares won't even consider taking her in. She's considered special needs, obviously, from the G2, but it's not. I guess that's apart from being a dad, that when I hear special needs, I think it's a mental need. I don't necessarily associate it with a physical need, which is probably wrong on me. I never put the thought into it prior to this. So if anybody out there wants to leave a comment about what a terrible dad I am, I'm sorry. But just being honest with you guys.
I think a lot of people hear the phrase special needs and they do make that leap. But yeah, I mean, if you boil it down to the actual two words, it's just they have a need that's going to be different, and a need like a feeding need is an important need.
Yeah, so where we live, we had two options. There's a school that's, I don't want to call it a school, it's a daycare system for extreme special needs. So these are children that will never be able to take care of themselves. The problem with that is they didn't have the capacity to give her all the other training that I don't want to say normal because that's not the right term. That sounds terrible saying it that way. They wouldn't give her all the playtime that kids that aren't special needs would get.
Right.
So that's the dividing line between my daughter and other areas. Everything else about her is completely normal. She has this special need in her stomach. So, for anybody out there, so they know that I'm not being a complete D-bag here, is that this school, they wouldn't let her go and play because they don't have staff to go outside and play, things of that nature. They don't have a way to, when she starts to walk, to help her walk. They're not a daycare. It's more of a medical facility to allow them to stay at. So that didn't make sense to put her in there. It was a last resort. And finally, we found a daycare here that just opened, and they said that they would be willing to take a look at what the need was and determine if they're comfortable to do it. So the great thing about this pump, if there's anything I guess you can say that's nice about it, is that you don't need to be a medical professional to use it. You just have to understand how it works. And that's, my wife and I aren't medical professionals, and we do it. So they were comfortable doing that. Now, there are some scary things about it that were terrifying for us the first time that, looking back, I'm like, yeah, I guess we're comfortable doing it now, but it's the way the tube fits in. I'm sorry, I'm just rambling. At any time, if you want to stop and ask me a question.
It's all good. It's all good.
So the tube, as I mentioned earlier, little button goes into her stomach, and then there's a balloon at the end of the button that you fill with water, and that stops it from pulling out very easily. The thing is, it can get pulled out. And with how small of an incision it is in her intestine, if it pulls out, you have about a minute before the body seals that hole, and then you have to have surgery again. So we never want her to have to go through surgery a second time, especially now that she's starting to be more mobile and she has memories. But I think it was like 2-3 months in when we were watching her, we had an IV pole that we hung the bag on, and then the machine connects onto, and then the tube goes to her. And our dog walked by and bumped the pole. When he bumped the pole, it moved, and it scared him, and he jumped, and the pole fell, and it pulled her button out. And they showed us how to put the button back in. And for anybody who might be going through this, I'll let you know there's a couple ways you can solve this problem. You need to keep the hole open. So even if you take a Q-tip and jam the Q-tip in there, which is something that they recommended if we don't have a button with us, you can take the button that's already there, but you have to drain the water of it, push it back in, and push the water in, which requires a special syringe to do. Or you can put a brand new button in. But even if you put a brand new button in, you have to fill it with the water so that it doesn't pop back out. So our child crying because it's painful when that happens, freaking out. We take the new button, we push it into her. I'm holding her down as my wife is filling the button up. And then because we were worried about anything else, we rushed her to the ER to make sure that we did it right and that nothing else was hurt during that. And, fortune was on our side, and there's nothing out of it. So we did it right. But it was a frightening experience. And since then, knock on wood, we haven't had it since then. And she's to the point where she's crawling, but now she has the other side of the problem. She's interested in it because she wants to play with everything, and it's a part of her body. And she, if we have her top off, she immediately goes, I'm going to grab that. And we've caught her almost pulling it out of her before. So any other parents that might have to go through this, you can buy what we call tubey tops. They're pretty cheap. It's just like what it sounds like. It's a tubey top for a baby. You put that over it, and it stops them from playing with it. And then we have a little bit like piece of gauze, like specialized foam gauze that we have to change out 3 or 4 times a day because it unfortunately leaks, which is something else that they did not prepare us for. Was that the side of the button, it looks like, this is going to sound disgusting, it looks like pus sometimes that comes out, but it's actually a type of mucus that's coming out from the surgery area because it's trying to heal up. So that comes out. And then if you don't have the bubble filled up properly, it can also just leak some of her milk back out as well. So you have to constantly be watching this and monitoring it. So I told you a bunch. I'm sorry. I'm sure you have a ton of questions.
I mean, a lot have popped up and come and gone, but the one question that I'm really curious about, I hadn't really thought about before now, but I'm curious as to when you're meeting other parents, like maybe it's at a playground, through the daycare, whatever it might be. How do you approach like dad chat or parent chat, which often I'm sure a lot of people listening know is primarily very small talky, and it's, how old was your kid? What have they been doing? What's the developmental milestones? What was like if they were still a baby? Maybe it's like, what's the birth like? Have they started eating solids? Blah 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 blah. And like anyone who's been a dad for more than 2 minutes has probably had loads of these conversations that have just been like water off a duck's back, that don't really have much of an impact for them. I'm curious, what's it like for you when you meet other parents and you're maybe having these conversations? Does it ever feel as though you're happy to be talking about these sorts of things? Are you ever happy to meet a parent that might not know some of the challenges that you have with your daughter? Or do you ever find it frustrating if they're maybe complaining or whinging or sharing a challenge that they're having that might be pale in significance to the challenges that you and your wife have been through? Have you ever had either of those experiences?
Yeah, I think my wife would probably be able to answer this a little bit better just because she has the bulk of these conversations. I'm kind of disconnected just because I'm a very isolated person. I'm a very private person. So unless somebody directly asks me something, I generally don't overshare information. And the great thing is with our daughter, she hits all of her other developmental milestones. So if she's not being fed, you don't know that there's anything different about her. The button doesn't protrude so heavily that you can see it through the clothing. So she's, starting to learn how to walk. She's doing the weird little wobble that kids do. Most of the time, it's just like that. But if she's being fed, so what my wife has done, since she's mobile now, it doesn't make sense to have her isolated in one spot while she's feeding. She has this little tiny baby backpack, and she's sewed things onto it so that she can feed the tube through it into our daughter, and then she has this little backpack, and she has 2 backpacks, what we call a going out backpack, which is just a plain purple kid's backpack, and then a cute little yellow backpack that looks like a cat's face, and that's her, like, I'm being social, we're going to like the park to play type backpack. And it just looks like she's wearing a school backpack, with the exception there's this tube that comes out and then goes into her clothing. And when people ask what's going on, I just tell them exactly what I've told you in a shorter, she's unable to swallow her food because she was a premature baby, and she has a G tube, which pumps food into her stomach until she learns how to swallow. And then the next question I always get immediately after that is, how long does she have to have the G tube? Which, unfortunately, the answer is when she decides that she doesn't want to. And that's not me being facetious. That was the medical answer. But yeah, they come back and they say, hey, it's just whenever she can take enough calories by herself, that's when we can take it out. And she is taking some calories, but until she can fully support herself without being fed by the machine, it stays with her.
Wow. So you guys have been through so much to manage with this. I'm curious. I mean, we've spoken a lot about obviously the main part of it, but right here, right now, reflecting on your daughter's life, what would you say has been the kind of like biggest success for you, like as a father? And this, we often talk about being a father through the lenses of successes and stresses. Like, I'm curious, right here, right now, what are you able to look back on as a success from your parenting journey?
I don't think it has anything to do with her condition. I was really worried that the two of us weren't going to bond early on, and I don't think it has anything to do with her condition. I think talking to other dads now, they all feel that initial, like, when are you and I going to be a thing?
Yeah. Yep.
It's like,
That's a good way to put it.
When are we going to hang out and be cool with each other? And when my daughter got to the point where she's able to do things and show more emotions, I'll come into a room and she immediately throws her hands at me. And I'm like, okay, she wants dad. Sometimes she'll come over when I'm doing something or I'm playing with her on the ground. And instead of playing with her toys, she drops them and she wraps her little arms around me. And those are the moments that I'm just like, okay, I'm doing something right.
Definitely. No, I mean, I like, the days must have just felt insurmountable at times. 68 days in the NICU, and obviously all those days following of caring for your daughter in such a unique way. Let's say it's an experience that most fathers aren't going to go through, but I don't want to kind of like paint it as something like just anything that it's not. It's just a little bit different, and I'm sure they're so nice to hear, like, that's what you've kind of like pulled out of it. And yeah, I agree, like, so many dads do kind of say that. It's like, oh, my kid's 3 months old, when am I going to enjoy spending time with them? Like, it takes a while for a dad to actually say that question to someone else, like, oh, I'm going to sound like such a terrible dad, but when am I actually going to enjoy this? And it is something that comes through all our brains, and it's definitely the thing that I often look back on as well, that the feelings might not be there at first. At least they weren't for me. Like, I often tell other dads that, those first couple of months, I just had to keep showing up and keep doing the things I had to do and taking my responsibility, as a dad and as a husband. But it comes, and the relationships we get to grow are so special. And yeah, man, it definitely sounds like you're doing lots of things right, for sure. And I really do appreciate you opening up. I mean, there were other things we could dive into for sure, but yeah, we could chat about this for a long time. But let's just change angles a little bit, because you spoke a little bit about what you do and that you're an author. Can you just, if you'd like to share with the listeners, just a little bit about the books that you've written and where they can kind of check you out if they're interested to hear more?
Yeah, if you'd like to look into my fiction writing, I write horror primarily, a little bit of sci-fi, but I stick in the horror realm. I've written Sinner's Pass, which is my most successful horror novel to date, and then A Full to Extinction, which is a sci-fi novel. If you like Jurassic Park, it's going to be right up your alley. Anybody out there, you can find me at ssfitzgerald.net. You can see one of my books in the background hanging out. By all means, feel free to check me out on Amazon. Sinner's Pass is also at Books A Million, most major retailers online. Or if you want signed copies, feel free to check out my website. I offer an ability to buy signed copies as well.
Awesome, man. I'll put all the links up in the description for sure. Now, the question I ask at the end of every episode, it's always the same question. If you think back to before becoming a dad for the first time, I think this is going to be a very unique answer for you from other dads, but maybe a week or two before becoming a father, what did that Shaun need to hear? Like, what piece of advice do you think Shaun from that time needed to hear before welcoming his daughter into the world?
I'd probably just tell myself that you don't need to be your dad. My dad was a pretty unique guy in a lot of different ways. And I think about that constantly with my dad, like my experience being a dad.
I mean, that's such a common thing. We're either striving to not be our dads or striving to live up to our dads, and that is such a minefield at times, because just not knowing the actions that we take can either reflect positively or negatively on the fatherly experience that we've had. And lots of dads have come on here saying that they want to break a cycle or try and continue a cycle, and it's not easy. So that's so pertinent. And thank you so much for sharing And Shaun, yeah, our time has flown by, but as I said, I'm sure there were other things that we could dive into, but I really hope that the listeners can kind of attach this story and the kind of feeling behind this towards possible fears of, the unknown, let's say, because you're able to come away from this and just say that, like, when your daughter drops her toys and just gives you a big cuddle, that, like, that's everything, and, like, that's still everything, and that's still this like monumental moment in your life as being a father. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. And you come through some absolutely difficult times, which I'm sure were full of fear, but, like, the dads are going to get that experience as well. There might be some concerns and some fears, but there will be that time when your kid just wants to give you a hug, and that's what it's all for. So, Shaun, I can't express in words just how much I appreciate you taking the time and chatting to us about this topic and going into such detail with us today on Dad Dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Laurence. And, for anybody that is about to be a dad and they're going through those same questions, or you're a brand new dad, the one thing I would just say is the best thing you have is time. It takes time for you to experience it. And then once you get to experience it, like I told you that I had a newborn and she's 14 months old. It starts moving too quick.
And then we have another Dad Dialogue conversation. Of course, a huge thank you goes to Shaun for coming on the show and sharing stories with us and being so open and vulnerable with us about the experiences that he and his wife had in terms of having the baby so premature, and then the processes that happened that led her to have these eating difficulties. I did really appreciate Shaun being just going into so much detail about it. As I said in the introduction, I think it's a difficult story to relate to for a lot of us, but I'm sure we can see the heart of another father who's trying his best to do right by his wife and do right by his children as well. So I think that whilst many of us won't have had this exact situation, and hopefully we don't have to go through this exact situation, we can still see and grow and learn and develop what it is to be a father that is doing right by their family in difficult circumstances that might be look a little bit different for different people. I have been in touch with Shaun since we filmed the episode. The interview was recorded a month or two ago, and his daughter's doing well, making progress, steady progress. He said the doctors have been saying that she's showing the right signs, and hopefully she'll eventually be able to eat food and not have the gastric tube inserted anymore. But it's very slow process, and they have to be patient. And it seems that this is just something that might go on for a little while for their family. So, yeah. And I really did appreciate talking to Shaun about all of this. And we did talk a little bit in the episode about his books that he's written. If you are interested in checking out any of his books, links, of course, will be in the description. But yeah, thank you so much for listening or watching today on the Dad Dialogue podcast. I hope you have an awesome day. If you want to get in touch with me, daddialogue.co.uk. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Goodbye.